Ethan Granger had not bought his land for prestige or profit. He had bought it for peace. After 30 years as a civil engineer, most of them spent in traffic-choked cities working on projects that seemed to grow more bureaucratic than practical, wanted nothing more than open skies and quiet earth. The 25 acres he purchased just outside Blackwood County offered exactly that. Rolling pastures gave way to oak groves, and a narrow creek cut diagonally across the property, its water cool and clean. At the center stood his modest farmhouse, nothing fancy, but sturdy, well-kept, and deeply his. He ran a few horses for pleasure, kept a garden, and spent most evenings on the porch, sipping coffee and watching the sun dip below the tree line. To Ethan, it was a refuge. A reminder that simplicity could still exist in a complicated world. For years, nothing disturbed his solitude. Neighbors were few and far between. And those who lived nearby understood the unspoken rule of country living. Fences marked boundaries, and boundaries meant respect. Ethan tended his land with pride, riding the fence lines on weekends, checking posts, trimming brush, and keeping things in order. The creek provided water not only for his animals, but for his peace of mind. Its constant trickle was a lullaby that underscored the rhythm of rural life. He had no interest in development, no desire for expansion, just the steady, honest satisfaction of knowing the land was his, and his alone. That sense of sanctuary began to fray the moment the Ashbrook Meadows subdivision broke ground on the adjoining parcel. At first it was only noise, the buzz of saws, the whine of trucks, the hammering of nails as row after row of identical houses sprouted on what had once been pasture. Then came the families, each moving into homes indistinguishable from the next. With lawns shaved into uniformity and mailboxes painted the same sterile white, Ethan did not begrudge them their choices. But he noticed how quickly their neighborhood became dominated by a homeowners association. A large banner went up at the entrance, Ashbrook Mendoza, Community of Standards. That phrase, Ethan thought grimly, was less a promise of neighborliness than a warning of control. At first, their attempts to rope him in were almost laughable. He received letters in the mail, politely worded but unmistakably insistent, asking him to coordinate landscaping choices to maintain visual harmony. One note suggested repainting his farmhouse shutters to match the HOA-approved palette. Another pointed out that his horses were distracting from the cohesive aesthetic. Ethan tossed the letters straight into the trash. His land was not part of Ashbrook Meadows. He had no contract, no obligation, and certainly no interest in letting a group of clipboard-wielding neighbors dictate how he lived. But the HOA was not accustomed to being ignored. What began as polite letters escalated into curt notices. What escalated into notices turned into visits from self-important committee members who showed up uninvited at his gate, rattling off demands about fencing and water runoff. Ethan would listen in silence until they ran out of steam, then calmly point to the weathered sign nailed to the oak tree at the edge of his drive. Private property. No trespassing. Most of them slunk away, muttering under their breath. But one man never seemed deterred, Carl Winslow. DSHO President Carl was the kind of man who thrived on small authority. Stocky and red-faced, he patrolled the subdivision in a shiny golf cart he treated like a police cruiser, sunglasses reflecting his own smugness. He introduced himself to Ethan once with a handshake that lingered too long and a smile that carried no warmth. "We like things neat and orderly over at Ashbrook," Carl had said. "I'm sure you'll want to be a team player." Ethan had simply raised an eyebrow. "I'm not on your team." From that moment on, there was an unspoken battle line drawn between them. The invasion came one quiet morning in early spring. Ethan saddled his mare, Daisy, for a ride along the fence line. The air smelled of damp earth and the creek gurgled softly in the distance. But as he rounded the southern edge of his property, something immediately felt wrong. The fence was broken, 3 posts knocked flat, rails splintered, and barbed wire coiled uselessly on the ground. Daisy snorted uneasily as Ethan dismounted, crouching to inspect the damage. Heavy machinery tracks cut through the mud, leading deeper into his pasture. His stomach tightened. Following the trail, Ethan's unease hardened into fury. A trench, nearly 3 feet deep, had been carved across his land. Running in a straight line from the subdivision toward the creek, white PVC piping jutted from the trench, some of it already glued into place, stretching like veins across his soil. At the creek's edge, a crude intake valve had been installed, siphoning water downstream toward Ashbrook Meadows. His creek. His water. They hadn't asked. They hadn't even notified him. They had simply trespassed, cut his fences, torn his land, and laid their infrastructure as though his property were nothing but a staging ground for their convenience. Ethan stood frozen, fists clenched, every instinct screaming to rip the pipes out with his bare hands. But training and discipline from his years as an engineer kicked in. He walked the line carefully, cataloging details like evidence, the direction of the trench, the make of the piping, the unsealed joints, the muddy footprints left behind. They had rushed the job, no permits, no care for boundaries. It was theft, plain and simple, not only of his land, but of his water rights. When he reached the subdivision boundary, the scene only worsened. Workers in neon vests were finishing connections near the street, while Carl sat smugly in his golf cart, clipboard in hand, directing them like a general. Ethan marched up, his boots caked with mud, and planted himself in Carl's shadow. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Ethan demanded, voice low, but razor-sharp. Carl glanced up lazily, barely acknowledging him. "Community infrastructure," he said, waving a hand. "We're running supply to the fountains and irrigation. It's for everyone's benefit. Don't make this difficult. You cut my fence. You dug a trench across my land. You tapped my creek." Ethan's voice rose with every sentence. "That's trespassing. That's theft. You had no right." Carl leaned back in the cart, the mirrored lenses of his sunglasses reflecting Ethan's own fury back at him. "Relax. It's just water. You've got more than enough of it. And you'll find it's easier if you just go along with the program. We'll consider the matter closed." Ethan stared at him, stunned by the arrogance. Years of polite restraint evaporated in an instant. He stepped closer, close enough that Carl finally had to lean forward, uncomfortable under the weight of Ethan's glare. "Listen carefully," Ethan said, his voice low and cold. "This is not your land. This is not your water. And if you think you can take either without consequence, you're in for a lesson." Carl smirked, though the edge of unease flickered across his face. "You do what you want, neighbor. But the system's already in place. Pulling it out now would be messy. And frankly, you don't have the power to stop us." Ethan said nothing more. He turned on his heel, mud flying from his boots, and walked back toward his farmhouse. Inside, he sat at his desk, pulled out a yellow legal pad, and began jotting notes. Pipe diameter, flow rates, water rights statutes, property deed references. The fury in his chest burned steady, not as rage but as resolve. They thought he couldn't stop them. They thought his silence meant submission. But Ethan knew something they didn't. Ownership was power, and he intended to wield it in ways they couldn't begin to imagine. That night, as the subdivision's fountains gurgled happily on stolen water, Ethan stood at the creek's edge, hands shoved deep in his pockets. The moonlight shimmered off the current, calm and steady. He smiled faintly, already mapping out the path ahead. The HOA had invaded his land, cut his fences, and claimed what wasn't theirs. They had mistaken his patience for weakness. Soon, they would learn that they had picked the wrong man to steal from. Ethan Granger had never been a man prone to rash action. His years in engineering had trained him to see problems not as obstacles, but as systems to be understood. Where others lashed out, he calculated. Where others fumed, he planned. After the discovery of the trench and the smug dismissal from Carl Winslow, Ethan felt the same steady resolve he had applied to bridges and water treatment facilities. This was a problem with a solution, and the solution lay not in fury, but in control. The first step was information. Ethan spent evenings in the county records office, a place where most men like Carl never set foot. The air smelled faintly of dust and copier toner. But Ethan moved with patience through the rows of filing cabinets and computer terminals. He traced the creek backward, pulling old survey maps, water rights documents, and property deeds. The subdivision's entire irrigation network, from fountains to sprinkler systems, depended on the narrow stream that flowed across Ethan's pasture. What fascinated him most, however, was the source, a neglected half-acre parcel upstream, where a natural spring bubbled to the surface before winding its way down to his property. That parcel, as it turned out, was not only unoccupied but delinquent on taxes. Its previous owner had defaulted years ago, leaving it to languish on the county's rolls, unnoticed and unwanted. For most people, it was worthless scrubbin'. But for Ethan, it was the key. He put in a quiet bid, paid the back taxes, and filed the paperwork. Within weeks, the parcel was his, and with it came the water rights. He didn't announce it. He didn't wave the deed in Carl's face. He simply waited, patient as the creek itself. Knowing the day would come when his ownership would matter, that day came sooner than expected. By midsummer, Ashbrook Meadows was in full bloom, or so it tried to be. The subdivision prided itself on green lawns, manicured shrubs, and ornamental fountains that gurgled day and night. But Ethan had seen how their system worked. They had tied their entire water supply to a resource they did not control. And so, one hot July afternoon, with the creek running low, Ethan turned the valve inside his newly built pump house and restricted the flow to a fraction of its normal rate. The water trickled downstream, barely enough to keep the fish alive, but not nearly enough to feed the artificial thirst of Ashbrook's ornamental paradise. At first, the subdivision residents didn't notice. A few sprinklers sputtered. A fountain sprayed weakly, but people assumed it was a temporary issue. Within days, however, the lush lawns began to yellow under the relentless sun. The grand fountain at the subdivision entrance, once a symbol of prestige, sputtered pitifully, producing more noise than water. Homeowners filed complaints with the HOA board, demanding answers. Carl, red-faced and sweating through his polo shirts, assured them the problem would be handled. But the truth was, he had no control. The pipes they had laid illegally across Ethan's land had no source to draw from, and the man they had mocked as powerless now held their entire community's lifeline in his hands. When the board finally marched to Ethan's farmhouse, they didn't come with letters or polite requests. They came shouting, demanding entry, insisting that he was tampering with community infrastructure. Ethan met them at his gate. Calm as ever, the deed to the upstream parcel tucked under his arm. Carl, leading the charge, jabbed a finger at him. "You cut us off. You can't do that. That's illegal. You're endangering the whole community." Ethan raised an eyebrow, unfolding the paper in his hand. "This," he said evenly, "is the deed to the land where your water originates. This," he continued, pulling a second sheet, "is the record of water rights transferred with that land. And this," he added, producing a third document, "is my property deed showing where you trespassed and laid pipe without permission." He let the silence stretch. The board members' faces pale and drawn. "So tell me again," Ethan said, his voice cool as steel, "who's breaking the law here?" Carl sputtered, sunglasses flashing as his composure slipped. "This isn't about law. It's about community. We all depend on that water. You can't just shut it off." "I didn't shut it off," Ethan interrupted, folding the documents neatly. "I reduced it to a level that ensures the ecosystem survives. My horses have enough. My creek has enough. What you don't have is the right to build fountains and keep golf course lawns green off my back. If you want water, you'll do it the proper way, with a contract, with payment, and with guarantees that my land will be restored." The rest of the board shifted uneasily, their bravado fading. They were not engineers, nor lawyers, and they knew nothing of the statutes Ethan had already researched. What they did know was that without him, their community would wither.
Ow.
Their angry homeowners would revolt, and their carefully crafted image of perfection would crumble. Carl tried to protest, but the tide had turned. The board members exchanged glances, and one finally muttered, "Maybe we should talk terms." Word of the confrontation spread quickly through Ashbrook Meadows. Homeowners who had once smirked at Ethan's horses now found themselves furious, not at him, but at the board that had overreached and left them vulnerable. Meetings turned chaotic. Residents demanded to know why their entire infrastructure had been tied to a resource they didn't own. Lawsuits began flying not against Ethan, but against the HOA itself. Carl's iron grip slipped as neighbors accused him of arrogance and incompetence. Within months, the once proud Ashbrook Meadows HOA collapsed under the weight of its own hubris. Ethan, meanwhile, repaired his fences, filled the trenches, and kept the pump house locked. He didn't gouge the subdivision for money, nor did he cut them off entirely. Instead, he drafted a simple, fair contract, a set monthly payment for access to the creek, funds that went toward maintaining his land and the waterway. Those who signed abided by his terms. Those who refused found their lawns browning under the summer sun. The balance of power had shifted permanently. And Ethan had made his point. Ownership and patience were stronger than arrogance and trespass. One evening, long after the chaos had subsided, Ethan stood on his porch with a cup of coffee. Watching the creek shimmer in the twilight, the subdivision's fountains burbled faintly in the distance, no longer symbols of dominance, but reminders of who truly controlled their flow. Ethan smiled, not with malice, but with quiet satisfaction. The HOA had invaded his land, cut his fences, and stolen what wasn't theirs. In return, he had given them a lesson they would never forget. The land and the water belonged to him. No amount of arrogance could change that. For the first time in months, the pasture felt peaceful again. Daisy grazed contentedly near the fence line. The oaks rustled in the breeze, and the steady trickle of the creek reminded Ethan of what he had always known. Peace was not something given, but something defended. And defend it, he had.